mbele yenu na mbele ya Mungu tunaahidi kulinda na kuendeleza fikra na harakati za hayati baba wa taifa. Nyayo zake tutazifuata. Alipobandua tutabandika na kujenga taifa lenye heshima.
You don't have one definition of Mwalimu.
A great leader.
True socialist. Mpenda haki.
A global figure.
A man of integrity.
Different qualities, in fact, made up Mwalimu. So maybe he is what Tanzania is in all its complexity. At least what was formative Tanzania.
Na Mwalimu Nyerere ameweza kuleta maelewano ya watu. Baadhi ya mkoa kwa mkoa ukienda wakuchanganya. Kwa hiyo ni picha ambayo ameiacha ya kuelewana watu mpaka kesho.
Mwalimu was really an intellectual and, who wielded power very, very effectively, and wielded power not for his benefit but for the benefit of society.
He tried to improve the general lot of every Tanzanian, and he expected his children to fit into that attempt to improve the general lot of all Tanzanians.
Julius Kambarage Nyerere was born on 13th of April 1922 in the village of Butiama in the Lake region in the north of Tanzania. The location of his birth is today occupied by the Nyerere family home, his mausoleum, and the Mwalimu Nyerere Museum.
Kambarage grew up as an ordinary child. He didn't enjoy chieftainship.
Julius was the fourth child of his mother, Mama Mugaya Nyang'ombe, who had 8 children. Mama Mugaya was the 5th wife of the 22 wives of his father, Chief Nyerere Burito of the Zanaki people. Close family friends have said that Julius stood out among the chief's children.
I think his mind, he was born that way. Because even his father, he had a dream that Nyerere was a different child.
At the age of 12, he began formal education at Musenge Primary School in Musoma town, 40 kilometers from Butiama. At this school, he excelled, and it marked the beginning of a journey that took him to Makerere University in Uganda, where he graduated in 1945 as a teacher, and later to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where he gained a Masters of Arts degree in Economics and History in 1952.
And in January 21st, 1953, he got married to Mama Maria Nyerere.
Rafiki yake ndiye aliyesema kwamba alikuwa anayekufaa hata yeye kama ni elimu, tena namwambia hivyo kwa maana na yeye alikuwa katika kundi langu lile. Kama ni elimu wote ni walimu, kama ni uzuri wote ni wazuri.
This name of Mwalimu was very much used by 2 old people when he was teaching at St. Francis College. And that was an old man called Schneider Planton and Mzee John Rupia. Whenever they saw him, say, Mwalimu, habari gani, how are you? So you see, everybody sees. And of course he was Mwalimu. I mean, professionally he was Mwalimu, he was a teacher.
The first time I saw him was during the first history class I had there. And that was in 1955. And I think he must have given us only an additional 2 or 3 lessons before he resigned to spend all his time in political organization and the fight for independence.
In 1953, Julius Nyerere was also elected president of the Tanganyika African Association, TAA.
Everything was racially here, like apartheid. We had Tanganyika European Association, Tanganyika Indian Association, and Tanganyika African Association.
TAA was transformed into Tanganyika African National Union, TANU, in 1954. Nyerere resigned from teaching to lead TANU in the struggle that would bring independence to the Tanzania mainland territory of Tanganyika in 1961.
When he started the struggle for independence, I was still a student in school. And the first time I saw him in person was 1957. I was then in grade 11 at Tabora Secondary School. And he had just come from Ghana, and he came to address us of his impressions and what it meant to us. In 1958, we were supposed to go into elections, and the British government had imposed on us that every voter had to vote for 3 people, 1 Asian, 1 African, and 1 European.
And the majority of the delegates to the TANU conference had objected to that, and they said they should boycott the elections. Mwalimu stood very firmly and said, no, you should accept it.
Jamal was the Secretary General of Indian Association, Tanganyika Indian Association, and Ratansi, another Asian. He was the President of Indian Association. So Mwalimu said, why don't you open the door?
At the end, Mwalimu was able to convince his colleagues, you see, to accept the colonial government proposal. And TANU did put up some European and Asian candidates. In the case of Jamal and Derek Bryson, they remained to be TANU members until they died.
That is when he broke the back of those who thought the independence struggle had to have a racist backbone. That racism or just color would have to be the main prop or the main support for its independence struggle.
I think Mwalimu had built that culture of tolerance, had built this whole concept of people being united, different groups, religion, tribe, and so on, being driven by a common view of world and life.
I think Nyerere knew that he would not have achieved the popularity he did without the women. He knew. And I think that's why, until his death, he was very grateful to what the women, particularly the Swahili women, did for him.
He also, I think, encouraged women in his own way to get an education, get their lives, and get on and participate in the nation building.
They had a critical contribution in allowing the movement, the liberation movement in Tanzania to grow. And if it was not for the women, it would have not grown in the, not only with the speed, but also with the rootedness that it did.
As the leader of the independence movement, then as the head of the newly independent state, Julius Kambarage Nyerere went on to confirm his place as the father of the nation of Tanzania.
He was in power for only 44 days. From the 9th of December to the 22nd of January, he resigned as the Prime Minister and made Mr. Kawawa Prime Minister.
Saa 3 asubuhi mimi naitwa na waziri mkuu. Asinakwenda Mwalimu anasema Rashidi, wewe ni waziri mkuu tangu sasa. Kichako hiki hapa. Kwa kishindo cha mwaka.
He gave up the position of Prime Minister for a whole year because he felt that the unity was easy while it was in opposition to colonial government. Now you had an own government, and the role of the party then had to be reviewed, and its developmental role had to be inculcated and strengthened.
That's when he wrote the 1962 constitution. He had to rewrite the constitution of the party, in which he put 10 principles of governance. When he said, I believe in the human brotherhood and Africa is one. I will serve my country and all its people. I will sacrifice my person in order to eradicate poverty and exploitation. Corruption is the enemy of justice. A position of authority, it is a position of trust. I will educate myself to the best of my ability and use the education for the benefit of all. I will cooperate with my fellow citizens to serve our country. I shall say the truth. I'll be an honest member of TANU, and finally I will respect the president of Tanganyika at that time. Those 10 principles really describe what type of a person Mwalimu was.
Alikuwa na misimamo yake, alikuwa anaamini kwamba binadamu hana haki ya kuwa na haki ya ziada kuliko mwingine. Wote tuna haki sawa sawa. Kuna vitu vya msingi ambavyo wote lazima tuvipate.
He realized that a new young state had to build a sense of nationhood in unity. Without that unity, the state could not really function.
The new nation, led by President Nyerere, was being forged in the global climate of the Cold War. There were also the high expectations and the impatience of the newly independent people. The immediate impact of all these influences was to be felt in 1964. This was a year of crisis, a year of events which began to define the leadership of Mwalimu Nyerere. During the month of January, momentous political changes had taken place in Zanzibar.
The 1964 revolution in Zanzibar was a momentous occasion. Zanzibari Africans deciding to take up arms and overthrow the Sultan. It was certainly earth-shaking when it took place. It was also important because those who organized this uprising were members of the Afro-Shirazi Party, and the Afro-Shirazi Party was a sister organization to TANU.
In fact, Mwalimu Nyerere was there when Afro-Shirazi was being founded on the 5th of February 1957.
Baada ya uhuru, huku uhuru wetu tuliopata na kule Zanzibar mapinduzi, tukatumia nafasi hiyo kuungana.
In fact, there was an understanding before the independence even of Tanganyika between the two parties that in case both of them get independence, then they will unite. So one could see that that the union of Tanganyika and Zanzibar was the natural thing.
The union issue was not necessarily the best so far as Mwalimu's leadership is concerned. I've shown how he had to make many decisions which are more pragmatic rather than principled in terms of his views on Pan-Africanism.
Ilikuwa siku moja Mariam Karume amefanya safari kuja Tanganyika, Dar es Salaam, kumtembelea Mwalimu. Basi wamekaa hivi, kwa bahati mimi nilikuwa pale pale. Mzee Karume akasema, Mwalimu, sasa nchi tuko huru, tuungane. Mwalimu sawa. Basi ita magazeti tutangazia tumeshaungana. Mwalimu akasema ngoja kwanza mzee, ngoja kwanza tukashauriana na baraza yetu ya sheria. Basi wakubaliana yeye aende Zanzibar, akazungumza na Baraza la Mapinduzi, na Mwalimu huko azungumza na parliament, shakubali. Basi ndio muungano.
Of course, also one cannot dismiss the fact that there were also pressures from outside, especially from United States and Britain, because there was a scare at the time that Zanzibar might develop into another Cuba. It was a period of Cold War, and the Western countries were thinking that, you know, that if you allow the Zanzibar revolutionary government to continue with these programs, they might influence the mainland, and not only Tanganyika, but also Kenya and Uganda and so on. But of course, there were also, you know, the internal situation in Zanzibar itself. I mean, you know, the revolutionary leadership was divided into factions, you know, and Karume's faction, in order to survive, thought that the most important thing was to forge unity with the mainland, so as to ward off whatever intrigues and conspiracies of his rivals and so on. So those are the circumstances in which the union came. But having been established, then it became an important entity, not only in this region, but in Africa.
I think Mwalimu believed very much in the union and the benefits of the union. But unlike what I think came after Mwalimu, I don't think leadership, subsequent leadership, engaged with Zanzibar the way Mwalimu engaged with Zanzibar.
Well, I don't think he would have said that every aspect of the structure of the union was frozen for eternity. That it could not, that nothing could be done to reform it or to make it better. No, I do not. What I think he would have insisted upon is the maintenance of, in modern terms, of one Tanzanian nation.
Abeid Karume of Zanzibar and Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika were the two leaders who established the Union of the United Republic of Tanzania, 1964. On the 20th of January 1964, President Nyerere's leadership was severely threatened when a group of soldiers of the Tanganyika African Rifles rebelled and took over their barracks in Dar es Salaam.
The army mutiny, which happened as in all three East African countries, Kenya, Uganda and Tanganyika, just around the time of the revolution, I think was a serious one.
The army went to the State House searching for him. Oh yes, it did occur there, but fortunately they did not find him there. After 2-3 days then, he showed up and everything was quiet.
We also had the Congo crisis. Lumumba had been assassinated. President Olympia of Togo was also assassinated. And the very survival of the new leaders who had come to power, was at stake.
Mwalimu himself admitted once that he felt very humiliated when he had to ask the British Army to come and crush that mutiny.
It was actually the British Navy which bombarded the Colito barracks and arrested all the mutineers.
The idea was not to overthrow the government. The idea was the army people were demanding the Africanization of the top brass of the army.
There's the dawn of acknowledging the necessity of having a national army. That is what the mutinies really emphasized. And from it, we built what is now the Tanzania People's Defense Forces.
And the TPDF was created not only with new recruits and new leadership, but also political education was inculcated into the army. You see, his philosophy was that the army guys had to know why they were holding arms, whom were they defending, you know, those arms should be directed against whom, and so on. So, which was very interesting. As a result of that, we got an army that not only defended the country, as was seen during the invasion of Idi Amin, but also became an exemplary army in the whole region, and did train a lot of freedom fighters.
That mutiny, it never went out of Mwalimu's mind, particularly in terms of for an African leader to be able to survive.
In 1961, with the independence, there was a threat to the unity of the country because of a lack of understanding of the ruling party vis-à-vis the government of independence. 3, 4 years later, 5 years later, there was a danger again to the unity of our people because of the beginning of the emergence of a tremendous gap between the majority of our people and those who were in public office in terms of their incomes and their prospects. So questions were arising now about the ownership and management of natural resources of this country. Questions were arising about political leadership values. There was also the question of who really would bear the brunt of our development, and therefore the interpretation of the concept of self-reliance. So out of this looming danger of not just a gap, but a deep chasm between, loosely speaking, between rulers and ruled, so to speak, we had the Arusha Declaration.
The central idea of Arusha Declaration is equality of all human beings. Okay? It's really about equality, much more than distribution of wealth. And I think it's the cornerstone of Mwalimu's ideology.
And to also build a society that is self-reliant, that will count on its own true resources and strengths, that will be less dependent on foreign handouts, a nation with dignity.
A society where people work together for the common good, where certainly in terms of the agricultural policy, villagers came together so that they could be supplied with water, with other amenities, social amenities, which they could not so easily be provided with if everyone lived 5 kilometers away from one another.
Overnight, as a result of that change, we had achieved clean water to about 40%, health facility to 45%, 90% literacy rate.
For me, it was the clearer definition that aid could not be the basis of our development. That there, we went on to outline the meaning and the meaning and the burden of self-reliance.
Tanganyika, or Tanzania later, went through all the motions that other countries were going about inviting foreign investment and so on and so forth. They were only interested in getting raw materials, etc., but not ready to develop the country. So, it almost became a practical necessity for the state to take over the major means of production.
It said the natural resources of this country belong to all the people together. And to make sure that they do so, their disposition would have to be placed in the hands of the state. And a state that would be democratically elected, and therefore how those resources were disposed of would be with the consent of the majority, and therefore reflect the interests of the majority.
I don't think at any point, not in his writings nor in his speeches, that at any point he rejected the universality of socialism. But he tried to, first of all, to define it as the only rational choice for a third world country.
He took over all the schools, practically all the schools, nationalized all the schools that had been built by missionary organizations and other bodies, made them all public schools, opened the doors to every Tanzanian child who was able to study.
What I will never forget is when we entered Form 1, that was 9th grade then. My dad was working with the railways and his salary was 150 shillings, and we were 4 of us who are now in middle school. But then 2 of us were to enter into secondary school, and the school fee then was 960 shillings. When my dad was struggling to get the school fee, we were told there was now remission, no more paying of secondary school fees. If it wasn't for him to say there is free education, maybe I wouldn't have been where I am now.
National service also turned out to be a very useful tool in terms of getting people, young men and women from different parts of the country who had never known that such and such an ethnic group existed in one camp. Started making friendships with people outside their ethnic groups and so on and so forth. And I think this was a very, very important aspect of that policy.
Arusha Declaration for many in Tanzania was also a time of transition. It was a time of hardship. It was a term of alienation from what people knew to new ways of being.
How you mobilize those resources for development, in terms of structures you build, in terms of human resources that you develop, there I think is where the shortcomings started coming in.
Originally, I think for Mwalimu, these villages were to evolve gradually as people understood the benefits of coming and living together. But I think at some point this process was too slow. And Mwalimu said, no, we have to now get into villages. I think that was a problem. Because what it did then, it unleashed some of the negative elements of the state, where now force was used. And once you start using force, you obviously create a lot of harm.
I was at 10 at independence. I became part of that social engineering. Having born in Ifakara in Morogoro region, gone to school in Morogoro, and then my high school in Bukoba, and from Bukoba National Service to Makutupora. National Service put me at another level of social engineering. The best person for me was not my tribesman or the person of similar religion, religious belief. It was the person next to me. And this is how I grew up. So, indeed, there are some losses, social fabric, or whatever, but we gain more than what we have lost.
It didn't provide material, benefits, so to say, directly, but at least it gave hopes. Millions of Tanzanians rallied around it, especially in its policy of self-reliance. People felt strong and they felt that they could do things on their own, you see. And if you look at the statistics during that period, 67 to 71, if you look very carefully, you could find that, in fact, despite the breaking off of relations and the withdrawal of aid, we were able to accomplish quite a lot of things during that period.
Tanzania was not the failure. It was not the only country that failed in those years. All Africa failed in those years, plus or minus. But I think the difference that we failed while trying to work for something good. Others failed because they didn't try to do anything good.
Implementing the social and economic policies of the Arusha Declaration brought Tanzania into conflict with international agencies and powerful governments around the world. But in spite of this growing opposition, Mwalimu's ideas inspired a sense of nationhood among Tanzanians.
I think as I was growing up, it was basically the theory that was very prominent in my life, you know, and we could justify each and everything on account of that theory. You know, the intent behind it all is that we all go to school, is that we all have minimum health care, is that likewise we break the barriers of that I am from this tribe or I am from this community, I'm from this ethnicity. We did not want that in Tanzania.
That body of ideas comprising the Arusha Declaration and the other documents that surrounded it, education for self-reliance, socialism and rural development, seems to me still Mwalimu's legacy.
During the 1970s, opposition to Tanzania's development policies became increasingly more challenging for President Nyerere. But Mwalimu's development goals were rooted in a Pan-African vision. This vision also embraced the idea of regional integration. The establishment of the East African Community in 1967 was a step in this direction.
He worked to consolidate, obviously, the unity of Tanzania, but he always simultaneously was leaving, if you like, the window or the door open for associating with other states in the region into a greater union.
I'm committed to the unity of our continent. I believe a genuine future for Africa lies in unity. I was realistic enough to realize that there was no possibility of the United States of Africa coming by some kind of miracle. But East Africa was a very different thing. We were very united and we should have maintained it. Did not happen. I think it's a shame. And I think we, East Africans, and in particular the leaders of East Africa themselves, have to accept the blame. We should never have allowed the East African community to break up. It has broken up.
He expressed the willingness to delay Tanganyika's independence so that the three countries acceded to independence at the same time. That didn't work. But it didn't stop him from continuing to work for East African cooperation, which went on very well until Idi Amin came to power in Uganda in 1971. And two, there were disagreements about who gets what and for what reason. And because the authority could not meet, because Nyerere had refused to meet Idi Amin, there was no mechanism put in place to adjudicate in these arguments. So almost naturally the community died.
Internationally, Mwalimu Nyerere remained influential, and he firmly placed Tanzania in the forefront of the efforts to liberate Southern Africa and to realize the ideal of African unity.
Mwalimu, as soon as his country became independent, got all freedom fighters from this region. Our liberation movements moved to Tanzania. From there, we operated and visited other countries to get support from friendly countries, those which sympathized with our struggles. From there, we operated. Mwalimu looked after all of us very well.
The acceptance of by Tanzania to host the Liberation Committee was accepting very delicate responsibilities for the continent.
And it was a recognition in a way of the steadfastness of Mwalimu's vision on the African liberation.
The cause of liberation of South Africa was so close to the hearts of our people that they really were prepared to sacrifice, to go to any length to sacrifice to assist their brothers liberate themselves. And they did. And on that one, even those who thought Mwalimu's ideas on the economic front, for instance, were wrong. But certainly in terms of supporting the liberation struggle, he had the whole population behind him.
He mobilized more than anybody, in my view, that struggle, the African people of that struggle. But for Mwalimu, this was the essential thing, because it was the expression of independence. It could not be alone in Tanganyika, as Nkrumah had said. As long as one state was not free, we were not all free. Mwalimu believed this completely, you know.
When many South Africans were living in Tanzania, we tried to make an environment where they did not feel homesick. Because, yes, you could come in as a refugee, but for him, and in terms of that legacy, being a refugee didn't mean that you stay in camps. You could likewise contribute to our nation building and well-being, because we are about building one Africa.
I remember about Mandela when he was released. I was still in primary school, and he came to Dar es Salaam, and then we told Dar es Salaam going to look at him. I mean, there was something. There was this common feeling and common satisfaction that we've been a part of this movement.
No doubt, he was really, thrilled to be in South Africa to see the change of guard, to see the African taking over the political management of South Africa, and that was the culmination of the efforts of the entire continent.
I also think it was quite telling that when Mandela came out of prison, one of the first countries that he actually chose to pay tribute to was Tanzania. Again, I think that speaks volumes as to the legacy that we have as a nation, but I also think that Nyerere has as an individual.
In 1985, after nearly 22 years, President Julius Nyerere stepped down as the head of state of the United Republic of Tanzania.
I think he did it at the right time. He did a good job when he was in power. He did the best he could, I believe so. I believe he had all the good intentions for his people and for his nation. And he wanted someone else to lead.
When he stepped down, actually, I can assure you, it was against the wishes of many of the policy makers in the party, the National Executive Committee of our party. They felt that he should go on, but he told them he had to step down. The time had come.
I think he felt so assured that he had created in institutions and a culture that it's going to be very difficult for a person to usurp power.
I think that is one of the things that he has given us, that power has to be shared. You don't just sit there, because he believes that new minds have to be there and bring new ideas and cherish the good ones that are there.
Mwalimu had got himself into a corner by the imperialism. Imperialism had pushed him in the corner as he was arguing against structural adjustment. It was, I think, in some way, really, an affirmation of the fact that the man was so great, he can say, this is my body of ideas. I do recognize at this moment that this body of ideas is cannot be realized. They are not wrong ideas. But this is not the moment for these ideas. So let me leave to allow somebody else.
He was a firm believer in the one-party state upon independence. But when it came to 1992, when we went into multipartyism, in response to the changed world, he was the greatest advocate of opening up the political system into multipartyism. And it surprised some people, but I think his weight helped us to agree on opening the doors and introducing a multi-party system in our country. His basic vision remained, but he was quick to understand the changed circumstances in which the pursuit of that vision had to be undertaken.
And after he left government, he became an elder statesman, still wielding a lot of influence on the political developments in Tanzania, although he was no longer in office.
Rafiki zake marehemu yule wa Jamaica aliyekuwa ameretire Mandre alimshauri tusiishie hii kazi ya kuongoza tu katika nchi binafsi. Mimi nadhani pia tuchunguze maendeleo ya kusini ya ulimwengu mzima. Wakaanza hiyo kazi. Mama alipumzika muda mfupi tu akaanza hiyo kazi.
Mwalimu was a much, in my view, in my experience, an even greater person, an even greater human being than he was when he was in the state saddle. Because, you know, all the paraphernalia was removed. And Mwalimu could sit down and talk.
He didn't segregate anybody. And the people just walked here freely. They talked to him of all walks of life.
While he was president, he built for himself a small house. And as some of his colleagues in government used to visit him, they were amazed how a president would have such a small house. So they said, no, Mwalimu, we have to build for you a larger house. When the party offered to build him a house in the 1980s, he chose this place. And so he decided to return to where his father is buried. The other large building that you see was also built for him by the Tanzanian army. It was actually completed during President Mkap's term in 1999, a few months before he went to London for treatment where he died. So in that house he stayed for about 14 days, I think.
Mwalimu Julius Nyerere died of leukemia in a London hospital on 14th of October 1999 after a short illness. He was aged 77.
It was a tragedy to lose him.
Almost the whole village cried, men and women.
I was not surprised by the outpouring, but I was overwhelmed by the depth of emotion. I knew he was a very loved and respected person in our country, and internationally too. But the outpouring of emotions of sadness and loss among people of all persuasion, of all faiths, was truly, truly overwhelming.
Nilipofika airport nasema kumbe sikufiwa mimi peke yangu, kumbe tumefiwa wote. Yaani mambo kama haya sio wa Tanzania, yaani ni pamoja na mimi ni Mtanzania. Alafu walipokuwa nalia unasema mama moja nilikuwa natoka kanisani nikamkuta ametangulia hapa, nikasema pamoja na mimi ndio mume wangu. lakini naona tena huyu kafiwa zaidi kuliko mimi. Sasa hiyo ikaendelea.
Different leaders came to Tanzania, and not even one dared to speak in a language other than Kiswahili. That for me was a very proud moment. And I think it somehow symbolizes who he was and the ideal he tried to propound.
At the level to which that one event of Mwalimu's death, how it brought the whole nation to realize the greatness of the man, you know. And in my view, it was the final stamp of the legacy of Mwalimu.
And by the permission of the Chancellor, hereby do install you, Isa Ghulam Said Shivji, to be the first Mwalimu Julius Nyerere Professor in Pan-African Studies of the University of Dar es Salaam.
I'm very much honored and humbled by this appointment. I think it's very significant because my view is, and I think this is shared by many African intellectuals now, that we need to not only fight towards Pan-Africanism, but we need to think Pan-Africanism. And I'm hoping that in this chair we can develop that.
This is the University of Dar es Salaam that, you know, people, not necessarily Tanzanians, but people from all over Africa, as well as the diaspora, knew, the Walter Rodney's University of Dar es Salaam. That is the Nyerere's legacy at the University of Dar es Salaam, I understand, or I recognize.
He always thought that higher education was really an investment by all the people, and that those who were privileged to receive it had an overriding obligation to save those who had sacrificed so that they could receive their education.
Mwalimu was a very, very inspiring person. You know, his sincerity in whatever that he did, you know, caught you and compelled you, you know, to do your maximum.
But for a man like him, who's an icon, a person who is respected, a person who has made a mark to be remembered. History, he will go down in history books, not only in Tanzania, in Africa and perhaps some other parts of the world as well. It was a tragedy to lose him. He was a statesman.
The legacy of Julius Kambarage Nyerere inspires pride, dignity, and hope among Tanzanians. For generations to come, he will continue to be Mwalimu, teacher.
Futeni machozi, futa machozi, futeni machozi. Nyimbo zilizokesha kuniaga zingali shibe ya moyo wangu. Mito ya machozi mliotiririsha ingali yastawisha mti wangu wa ujamaa. Jasho lilomwagika mlipopigwa jua kuniaga lingali manukato katika safari yangu. Futeni machozi, futa machozi. Haya, mikeka kunjeni inukeni, Kilimanjaro kileleni pandeni, macho nchi tupieni, kazeni roho, futeni machozi. Ona, mishumaa ya birthday wamewasha, oneni, sherehe waikoga, mwaka tokea uhuru kupata, wanasema. Oneni, ona, futa machozi, futa machozi. futa machozi. Angalieni. Futeni machozi. Fisi hima ya kondoo ngozi watupa. Kondoo wanalia, fimbo ya mchungaji ibutu. Sandwich ya bugia, yowe kupiga hawezi. Nani ainue ulimi? Hakuna. 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 Futeni machozi. Futa machozi. Futa machozi. Futa machozi. Mishindo ya mizinga masikio ingalipo. Wabutia mandege kulia hawajakoma. Wahenga mgolole